Hi, everybody. This is Mrs. Villemez. I just wanted to take a second to introduce to you our second unit, which is Unit 2B. And so, Unit 2A was all about literary fiction and nonfiction, but now we're moving on into poetry and drama. So, before we get started with poetry, I want to make sure that you really understand what makes up a poem and how poetry is different than other types of literature. So go ahead and take out your interactive journals because this would be a great time to take notes that you can use later on as we start writing our own poems and analyzing poetry. So, the first thing about poetry is this genre of literature is definitely different than anything we've read before. It has a heavy emphasis on emotions. It uses a unique structure, unique devices. Some poems have their own rhyme scheme. They have things called stanzas. They repeat sometimes a lot. And then other poems are just completely freely formed. They look like nothing else. So, poetry is kind of different because sometimes it follows rules really strictly and other times it's kind of just whatever the author wants to do. All poems do usually have a rhythm, though, and they rely heavily on literary devices like similes, metaphors, alliteration, personification, all those things that we studied in our last unit. Those are going to come into play during poetry as well. And in fact, they're probably going to be used even more heavily. Alrighty. So let's go ahead and look at parts of a poem because poems do have different parts to them. So as you can see in red, that is a line from a poem. So it's a single line. And then we have a stanza, which is a group of lines that are separated by a space. So you can kind of see that in the yellow box here. So this poem would have 1, 2, 3, 4 stanzas. This poem also has a rhyme scheme. So remember, not all poems have to rhyme, but the rhyme scheme is the pattern within the poem. So as you can see, each stanza rhymes with itself. So this pattern would be AA, BB, CC, DD. And so you start a new letter each time there's a new rhyme. So away and day rhyme, but door and more don't rhyme with away and day. So that has to be a new letter. So that's why this is B. And then me and key would be C because it doesn't rhyme with any of the ones above it. And then wrong and song. So do we see why we're using new letters each time? Some poems might be like AB, AB, CD, CD. Some poems might be like AA, BB, CC, AA, and then it might repeat the first rhyme again. And types of poems. So, like I said earlier, a lot of poetry follows really strict rules, and some of them just kind of do whatever they want. And it really just depends on the type of poem that you're looking at. So, there are a lot of different types of poems. We obviously are probably not going to get to every single type of poem, but I just want you to be familiar with some of these words: ballad, sonnet, epic, limerick, lyric, free verse. These are all different things that maybe you've heard before, but you didn't really know what that meant. And so these are all types of poetry, and each type has its own specific set of rules. This poem is a free verse poem because it doesn't have a rhyme scheme, but you can see the rhythm. You can see how it's separated by stanzas. If you were reading this out loud, there would be a rhythm to it. When you're reading it in your head, there should be a rhythm to it. You can see that some stanzas are longer than others. Some of it's written in italics. Those are all important things to look at. This is called a blackout poem. So the author of this poem blacked out all the words on the page except for the ones they wanted the reader to see. Shivering, brassy moonlight, ignite the dark night, lonely, haunted, end of the day. So it's a very short poem, but we can see how it adds to the artistic appeal of it. This is called a concrete poem. Do you see the shape that this is making? If we were able to look closer and read the poem, I guarantee you it would be about animals or maybe even pandas in specifically. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You might have heard that before. It's pretty famous. This type of poem is called a sonnet. Shakespeare made these very popular, and while we won't get to study much of these in 8th grade, as you move on to high school and you start studying Shakespeare, you're going to see a lot of sonnets. And this one has a very specific rhyme scheme. Lyrics. Some of you might be familiar with the Beatles and the song Yesterday. All music is poetry, right? It expresses a lot of emotion, it has a rhythm, it follows a specific specific structure, an ocean voyage as waves break over the bow, the sea welcomes me. This is a haiku. Do you guys know the rhyme structure for a haiku or the syllable structure for a haiku? So a haiku has to have 5 syllables at the front, 7 in the middle, and 5 at the end. So if you read it, an ocean voyage, that's 5 syllables. As waves break over the bow, 7. The sea welcomes me, 5. So these are really pretty because they sound so good when you read them. Not when you break them up like I just did to count the syllables, but they follow a very specific structure. And we also have slam poems, and we're going to be looking more at these as you guys do your project later on in the unit. But slam poems are really powerful because they're meant to be performed. Slam poems contain elements of rap, hip hop, storytelling, theater, jazz, rock, blues, and folk music. And they're characterized by rhyme, repetition, improvisation, and wordplay. It is meant to be performed, heard, and experienced. Since the first Poetry Slam in Chicago in 1986, the genre has provided youth with a creative and impactful way to explore issues of identity, belonging, prejudice, gender, social justice, and race. So as you can see, this was a really powerful tool for people to express themselves when they felt like they were going through something. And if you'd like to listen to this poem, there is a copy of the notes underneath this where it doesn't have my voiceover, and then you can come to the slide and press play on this, but I don't think it'll work if I play it while I'm talking. So now that we've looked at different types of poems, we're also going to talk a little bit about author's craft. And what that means is it's anything that the author does on purpose as the writer to make the writing look and sound a certain way. So the author does this in order to influence the reader so that when they're reading, they see it as a certain way, it sounds a certain way to them. It's anything that they do on purpose. They make a choice to do this. It's how they make their writing unique. So you can definitely probably tell when your friend is writing something versus your mom. And it's because of their unique tone, their unique style. And craft is expressed through word choice, punctuation, repetition, figurative language, imagery, things like that. All those things we've been talking about. So when you combine all those things together, that's what gives the author their own specific voice. And if you click here, we're going to have this on the next slide, but it's a little bit blurry. But when you're looking at this for your notes, you can click on this link right here and look at the different ways to describe author's craft. So like I said, it's a little bit hard to read here. But as we start analyzing poetry, you're going to look at how the author develops their craft and discuss why they make the choices that they do. When you write your own poems, you're going to use these strategies to develop your own craft because you'll be the writer. So you'll be doing things on purpose to impact the readers of your poetry. So the next thing that we are going to do is we're going to talk about analyzing poetry, and that's going to be in your guided practice section because I'm going to be showing you what to look for and how to kind of interpret the things that the author is doing so that you can really understand and analyze a poem to the best of your ability. So for now, just make sure you go back and take some notes on poetry. If I were you, I would maybe take notes about what author's craft is, maybe some different types of poems. I'm not expecting you to have all of these memorized. You don't have to copy down this chart by any means. And maybe just why poetry stands out. Like what makes poetry different than other literature? And what are the different parts of a poem? So remember, these are your notes, so feel free to take them as you need to. But remember, you can use these moving on in the future, so I definitely recommend it. Alrighty, everybody, that's all I have for you for your direct teach section. Next, we're going to move on to guided practice and start practicing analyzing poetry using the Swift method, and I'll teach you all about that in the next lesson.